I use media and I'm so thrilled to be here tonight. One of the most impactful things that's happened in my life was discovering the neurodiversity movement paradigm and an amazing community of neurodivergent advocates who are literally changing the world. And so this is just one tiny step as part of that journey. So thank you all so much for being here. One of the central tenets of the movement is that it's neurodivergent led, and we have two incredible neurodivergent advocates here with us tonight that we're so fortunate to have. So Kylia Kennedy is the CEO and co-founder of Autistics Unmasked. Kai uses they, she pronouns. And Autistics Unmasked is a newly founded autistic advocacy organization. Kai is an autistic ADHDer who, among other things, provides trainings, consulting services, and resources for schools and school districts, employers, parents, and more so they can better understand autistic and other neurodivergent people. And Jayjay Mudridge is also here. Jayjay uses they pronouns. And Jayjay is an accessible special education teacher, an academic tutor, an advocate, a speaker, a trainer on neurodiversity. Jayjay is autistic, is an ADHDer, and is dyspraxic. Jayjay was identified as autistic when they were 12 and has worked in, when you were 2. I skipped ahead. Jayjay was not speaking until the age of 12. And Jayjay has worked in traditional and non-traditional school settings in a variety of educational roles. And so we're so thrilled to have them both here tonight and for joining me. Welcome.
Well, glad you had that because I didn't have any myself. Thank you very much, Josh, for putting this together. And hi, everyone. I don't have my schedule is going to be, so I thought my meeting is not distracting. Let's just go ahead and get started. So our presentation today. Sure.
It's good because I forgot to thank the SEPAC board. Especially our fearless leader, Jesse, who's an amazing chair.
Okay, so our presentation today is on the neurodiversity paradigm, understanding kids from the inside out. So some of what we're learning in this course is an introduction into neurodiversity and neurotypes, reframing the thinking about neurodivergence, medical versus social disability, inclusive language accommodations, and social design for learning. This might shift a little bit. Jayjay's got some separate stuff too, so this is just kind of a general. So first point here is understanding neurodiversity, acknowledging and appreciating our differences. So of course, the first question is what is neurodiversity? A long definition here, I will be just reading off of the PowerPoint. Neurodiversity describes a diversity of brain types among people, with none inherently more valuable than another. Neurodiversity offers a lens that our functioning can be understood as a collection of brain dials. So cognition, sensory processing, body control, executive functioning, regulation, etc., which can be turned up or down into different degrees and in different ways. How each of our brain types serves us is largely and completely defined by our environment. What's being asked of us, the judgments and assumptions and combinations we make. And there is more than one way to experience the world. Many cultures, conditions, and experiences that affect the way we understand and experience the world around us. These ways of experiencing that are called neurotypes. And so some examples of neurodivergence is ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, and then mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression. So let me know if you slow down. someone transcribing or anything like that. Louder. So why are neurotypes important? Individuals with divergent neurotypes are often misunderstood. There is a lot of misinformation, stigma, and barriers that prevent others from engaging with us in meaningful ways. Individuals with neurodivergent neurotypes or divergent neurotypes often the world is primarily designed to support neurotypical, able-bodied people, and this affects the way that we are expected to function and interact with others, work, and learn. Neurodivergent and disabled children often are left to assimilate into the environment that's properly school. So I'm going to go into some misconceptions surrounding neurodivergence and myths and stigmas. So it's okay to remember if you've heard or believed any of these common myths, that's fine. We're learning today. Learning more about ourselves and neighbors and children is how we accommodate our society. So first things first, neurodivergence is not caused by vaccines. This is a common, unfounded myth that is supported by autism research. That is not supported by autism research. Neurodivergence is not a lack of empathy or emotions. Just like any other person, autistic people and other neurotypes have a range of emotions, and although we may go to socialize in different ways, emotions are still there. And it's not laziness. Inattentive and lack of motivation are common traits throughout the neurodivergent community. They're not excuses, it's just highly situational and often how we operate. So one myth that neurodivergence can and should be cured. Like we covered in the first section, neurotypes count for many of the ways that human brain function, plain and simple. So it's important to remember that divergent neurotypes such as autism are not diseases. Although neurodivergent children may face a number of barriers in educational settings, it's important to remember that these cognitive functions, not only developmental disorders, in other words, they really affect how the brain processes information and do not impede or amplify intellect. That's for ADHD, dyslexia, etc. Divergent neurotypes such as autism may become more common. It's not true. The CDC estimates that about 1 in 44 autists are children are autistic. This number has risen over the years as a result of families having more access to care and awareness of autism in general, but not as a result of autism or autistic children being born more frequently. Notably, the CDC figures as it is a significant understatement given the widespread under-identification, particularly among non-white males. So someone like me, a black female, would not get the diagnosis easily as someone like Josh. Autism is one of these. Neurodiversity and inclusion. So these are consequences of stereotypes. This information about neurodiversity can have adverse effects on children. Unfortunately, many teachers and parents don't have the information or resources needed to promote a safe, equitable environment for students, since we need students feeling excluded or suffering consequences from behavior that is actually just their neurotype and just natural for them. As parents and educators, we want our children to be dismissed or left behind. We never want our children to be dismissed or left behind. So the first step is understanding how to ensure equitable treatment for all children. This way we can prepare children to recognize and treatment and to better understand their needs as they grow. This will help them to advocate for themselves in the classroom if the teachers and peers are without the right knowledge and support, it's easy to label a child as a difficult or troublemaker. This fixed perspective of what is normal or acceptable can lead us into labeling certain students as gifted, which can not only put undue stress on students at this point of stage of life, but also lead to unhealthy attitudes towards learning. Both ends of the spectrum can affect children's self-esteem, so meaning the difficult child versus the gifted child. And love of learning at early age. Therefore, it's important to understand your neurotypes so you can properly identify and then support your child. I think now it is time.
We've done a lot. I don't know if I'm to go. What I have here, so I am Jayjay. I'm an autistic tutor who specializes in neurodivergent learning, and I was an accessible educator in the public school system for a while before I burned out from being viewed the same way my students were viewed, which was simultaneously too autistic to bring anything of value to public education, while also not being autistic enough to speak on well-being of autists in public education. So now I get to do what I love, which is talk about neurodiversity and connect with neurodivergent learners in neurodivergent affirming ways. A decent amount of what I'll be saying will be through the lens of autism, but I am also neurodivergent like Kylia. And a lot of what I'm saying extrapolates. So there are two ways of thinking about autism and neurodivergence as a whole, and I'll give an overview of each. But before I do that, I want to stress that the pathology paradigm, while it is the most prominent way of thinking about autistic and neurodivergent neurology, is reproduced and produced by society. Like it was taught by professionals to parents and teachers, who then pass that down to neurodivergent and neurotypical learners, and to neurodivergent kids. So if we want to be cycle breakers, we have to recognize that the cycle we are participating in. It doesn't make someone a bad person to adhere to this model, it just means that when we know better, we do that. So the dominant narrative on autism is exactly what it sounds like, the pathology paradigm explained by Dr. Walker. She's an autistic academic neuropsych. It's where most of the autism research is centered, like focusing on our perceived deficits, funneling this funded into how to prevent people like Kylia and I from existing, and typified by use of scary words, disorder, deficit delays, and so on. It's present when someone discloses an autism diagnosis and someone's like, I could never tell you're so social, or I'm so sorry, even worse. And when parents are encouraged to grieve their child's existence, which as the gestational parent of deceased infant is doubly enraging. The pathology paradigm is present when we reward neurodivergent youth for acting neurotypical and punish neurodivergent youth with planned ignoring or whatever for just expressing their neurology in ways that come naturally to them. It says that the way you exist confuses and intimidates me, I don't understand it, and therefore I want to extinguish it, and the way that you're allowed to exist is predicated on how comfortable I feel with it. But if we're not uncomfortable, we're not learning. So while that may not be the intent of parents and educators, it's often the result. In my work, I like to think a lot about impact versus intent. And even well-intended people reproduce the pathology paradigm, and even the best intentioned people can have a hand in helping neurodivergent people become ashamed and scared of their neurology. Like in similar ways that microaggressions against racialized minorities pile up to create layers of trauma. The same happens to neurominorities. Can you imagine existing in a world where you hear from every angle to grieve your very existence, constantly hear about studies that come out talking about how burdensome you are to the economy, or see research that posits that you lack theory of mind, or don't have empathy, or don't experience emotions, or that you're put in therapies to correct your naturally normal ways of existing? Are constantly ostracized for miscommunications, and then all of the heavy lifting on bridging the neurocultural communication gap is put onto you. I mean, plain and simple, it's traumatic, capital traumatic. Of course, like you grow up thinking irreparable damage had been done to you for something irreparable is wrong. But damage can be mitigated or even prevented if parents and teachers and mentors and educators adopted a different way of thinking about neurominorities. And that is the inverse of the pathology paradigm, which is the neurodiversity paradigm. Kylia gave an awesome primer on. Unfortunately, in my work, I see the idea of the neurodiversity paradigm like twisted into this, like, but it says that autism is a 24/7 bounty house, castle with superpowers. Like, no, I've heard that it romanticizes autism and neurodivergence too, but that's could not be further from the truth. The basis of the neurodiversity paradigm is the idea that all brains are different, that not better or worse, not good or bad, just different. It's not a political statement. All brains are different, and nobody thinks that biodiversity is too political. Here we are. Neurodiversity at its base level is the idea that neurodivergence is natural and normally occurring and value neutral. When we don't ascribe moral value to neurodivergence, we can do it objectively. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. Everyone has areas they need to improve on, but too often neurodivergent people's way of being is communicating, feeling, regulating. is argument as weaknesses instead of just features of their neurology. Oh, am I not long enough? So that I know.
They said that the sound on the Zoom wasn't great, so I'm trying to improve it.
So for example, we have social skills. They're just different. We don't have deficits in attention. We have trouble regulating our goes. We don't lack reciprocity. We hold it differently. We hold a lot of things differently. And one of the areas neuromajorities need to improve on is seeing this as a difference rather than a deficit and meeting us halfway. And yes, much of the time we, that is neurodivergent people, are disabled, but that doesn't mean we need to be eradicated or warned. It just means we need to get accommodated and accepted, or I have the all to say it, perhaps even celebrated, which is much of what the presentation itself will be about, because the pathology paradigm is produced by a society that sees difference as threatening, but like, what if we didn't? I love that it was just embarrassing ringtone. The medical model of disability and neurodivergence absolutely can be a disability, and disability is not a bad word. Puts locus of the struggles that come along with disability on the person themselves. A person is, for example, wheelchair bound, or they have attention deficits. Their mobility is a difference. It's less in the person with the disability. It's a problem in this model. The social model of disability aligns with the neurodiversity paradigm. It's the inversion of the medical model, and it views disabled as a verb. People are actively disabled, like Kylia said, by their environment and their society, and the expectations put on them. To illustrate it, what I mean is wheelchair users aren't disabled by their wheelchair. They're disabled by a society that doesn't accommodate people instead of walk, whether that is restaurant tables not having like accommodating wheelchair height, or door frames being too thin to accommodate wheelchair width, or apartment complexes or buildings that don't have ramps, or those ramps being too steep or rickety to be safe for them, or sidewalks being full of bumps and cracks. To use an example of the model in the context of neurodiversity, I'll talk about my own experience with my sensory nemesis, which is grocery stores. Which the words, they're so gross. I haven't been alone in one in like 10 years. I hate everything about them. They don't accommodate me, and I melt down every single time. And like, I don't know when the last time you tried in a Target bathroom was, but it's not great. So like they're full of visual and auditory clutter. The lighting is garish, and I can hear the electricity coursing through it. There's overlapping conversations my brain can't filter out, so I hear them over like the constant beeping and the screeching of wheels, and then I'm bombarded by a colony of colors and choices. And my local grocery store doesn't have a sensory-friendly shopping hour, and when those around me that do have it for like an hour one time a week, can you imagine if wheelchair ramp hours were open 1 hour once a week? It's ostracizing, and it makes what should be a routine adult experience inaccessible to me. So I have to go, I load myself up with stim toys and baggery sensory accommodating clothing, and I wear noise canceling headphones and sunglasses, which is also ostracizing because people give you the side eye and they mean like, you know, who's this person trying to be an adult? So if neurodivergent people ruled the grocery stores and everything else, schools would be pretty different. It's also my experience with schools. Overwhelmingly bright, loud, chaotic, or unexpected to be still and focused, which cannot happen at the same time. Inability to filter a classmate's conversations or desks away from me from the teacher's instructions, and on top of that, I'm then viewed as non-compliant or defiant or not paying attention, when in actuality I'm in a state of constant distress and just trying to do my best, and it doesn't have to be this way. So rather than thinking about our communication differences as a set of deficits or a set of uncouth behaviors to be corrected, I like to think of neurodivergence as cultural difference. And it's not a perfect metaphor, but it's a starting point. So things that constitute a culture, among other things, are shared languages, values, beliefs, customs, ways of spending leisure time, and these can all be encapsulated in neurodivergent neurology. For example, one neurodivergent shared value is not understanding or necessarily recognizing arbitrary social hierarchies. The vast majority of us don't put stock into social situations, and conversations for us are about connection rather than figuring where we stand in a group. when I was in school, I often got in trouble for disrespecting as a child because I spoke to teachers and adults the way that I would speak to Kylia or Josh or my husband, like as people like me. Answer that. Another shared value is a sense of justice. There's plenty of research been conducted into our investment in fairness, equity, and doing the right thing. And one of the research measures was, and I can link everybody to the study too, is whether people donated to charity more or less when someone was looking. And non-autistic people, neurotypical people, donated less often in less dollar amounts when nobody was looking, but not autistic people. And of course, in society, in the paper was framed as that we're too justice-oriented, we're too fair, it's a deficit. We should lie sometimes. I don't know. But so while our sense of justice can come across in different ways, for example, in different politics, it stems from the same source. We also have our own sociolects, as for shared languages. So a sociolect is a shared dialect based in social group rather than geographic region. And an example of them being different is our allowance for collaborative overlap, or what neuromaturities might call interrupting. With our executive functioning differences, sometimes we interrupt or forget what we're going to say, and with our excitement and investment in topics we love, sometimes it's hard to keep our excitement to what neuromajorities deem appropriate times or ways, and with our inability to read body language or facial expressions, we may often not know when the correct time to insert our contributions are, or we have this directness that's often perceived as aggressive, like capital A. It's very strange. Our spiderweb thinking leads to tangents because we're making connections that neuromajorities can't even begin to think about. So it seems like we're going off topic, and our natural way of showing empathy is relating personal anecdotes about ourselves or our interests. We have our own social customs that are rooted in neurology. Like we tend to eschew neuromajority notions of politeness, like small talk and greetings, which come across as garish and uncouth in neuromajorities. They just seem like extra steps. And as for leisure activities, anybody knows anyone neurodivergent knows the differences in play and rest. And when we think of neurodivergence as a culture, I feel like it allows for an equal playing field. It would be hard to find someone, or maybe not, who views their culture, or who might openly state someone's culture is less valid than their own, even if they don't understand why it works the way that it works. But cultures are different, not better or worse, and neurodivergent people are better, not worse, or different, not better or worse. And even if it's not an entirely accurate framework, it's a starting point to start shifting your thinking. The autistic, like, again, the deficit model is deeply rooted and produced by society, and so much of communication is perception. So when an entire group of people think differently and struggle to communicate how and why, especially with their, children, it's really, really, really easy to view that through a lens of pathology. Communicating across neurocultures is a two-way street, as it currently structured society requires neurodivergence to do all of the heavy lifting for this. We're seeing as needing our communication corrected, and this could easily be done away with if neuromajorities met us halfway, or even made overtures at understanding communication and becoming curious about our internal experiences rather than seeing them through the lens of their own biases. One hallmark of neurodivergence, particularly ADHD and autism, is spiderweb thinking. Our brains are like perpetual connected dots machines. ADHDers and autists in particular are perceived as having random thought processes, when in actuality we're making connections that neuromajorities don't see. I remember that I was consulting for a gym for neurodivergent athletes, and the owner was discussing that he was hungry and ready for lunch, and I started talking about my truck. And he was like, well, that's rude, that your thought processes are random, like it's not okay to blah, blah, blah. But there's a linear progression, and he was talking about lunch, and I had a sandwich for lunch, and my favorite sandwich is a tuna melt, and the best tuna melt I ever had was at a cafe in Maine. In Maine is where I go to wheel my truck, or we're talking about how I built my truck. And another example is one of my, I don't have favorite students, but if I did, this little boy asked me if my red checkered shirt was my favorite, and I asked him why, and he's like, well, I always save the best part of my meal for last because I want to end with that flavor, and you always wear your red shirt on Friday, therefore, are you saving your favorite shirt for last, right? So like these are connections that like you're not even thinking about it. It's just so joyful and wonderful that someone even like noticed that minutia of that make. And so we also have slower processing speed. Part of the reason we seem like we have slow processing speed, even though I just said we are perpetual connected dot machines, is because of these details, these constellations of connections that we're making. And in addition to that, we're processing sensory input that you can't even fathom. Like neurodivergent minds don't filter out sensory information in a way that prioritizes you speaking directly to me from the electricity coursing through the lights and the fan on in the other room that I can hear right now, and car doors shutting 3 streets away. And the world is just like beautiful in all its detail, and neurodivergence is this bottom-up thinking where we see the details first that then come together to form a big picture, whereas neurotypicals think the other way, where you see the big picture and then all the details come into focus. So it's really, really hard to filter all that when the world is so overwhelming and beautiful in all of its detail, which is where the monotropism comes in, right? So this is like the one true underlying feature of neurology, and it's forming an attention tunnel. It's a narrow focus, and both autistics and ADHDers get it in different ways. It's one of the reasons we struggle with transitions, particularly in schools, because when I'm doing a task or engaging with my special interests, my brain puts out like tentacles, and it weaves them into whatever I'm doing. And with my brain tentacles, I become part of whatever I'm doing. You can't separate me who's experiencing it and the activity itself. There's no separation between me and what I'm engaging in. And this means that I'm abruptly pulled out of the task and told to be done. It's like the tendrils are cut off. And now, like the alive thing they are, that's painful. Something's wrong, I'm shocked or pain. And the perception is that we as individuals who operate with monotropism are upset about being pulled from a preferred task to a non-preferred task or are being defiant. It's not a vie for control. You've cut off our brain tentacles. Why would you do that? When you give us time to retract those, to untangle them from whatever I'm doing with a slice of mop, we can pretty easily transition. It just, again, requires restructuring. We also emote differently. We're not emotionless. Like Kylia said, ADHDers don't experience emotions as too extreme. Neurodivergents hold it differently. It's related to Milton's double empathy problem. It's hard to recognize the ways different neurocultures express and experience emotions. Neuromajorities struggle to recognize the way we emote in the same way that we struggle to recognize the way you emote. And the remedy to understanding this is curiosity and connection, which is the underlying theme of everything I said. If you're confused, ask. Like part of our neuroculture is clarifying questions. We're not questioning your authority. We don't think you're questioning our knowledge. Like, ask us. That's the way. We also like info dump unboxed. I want to talk about it. So to follow that thread, when there's a lack of understanding of autistic and neurodivergent cognition and expression, and that misunderstanding is rooted in perception. The most pertinent example is how autistics and other neurodivergents are seen as inherently self-centered. But there's an underlying neurobiological imperative to this. So we have thicker neuronal branching, which leads to our associative memories. So when we remember things, we feel the feelings we felt during that moment. Again, to pull the thread and unravel that sweater. When someone shares something they messed up on, for example, maybe they bombed their interview or they fell on their face in front of the beach, the neuromajority idea of being with that person is often saying things like, that sucks, that sounds so hard, or I understand. But to neurodivergents, to autistics in particular, like my thought is, do you understand? How do I know that? Like I'm glad you're sorry. What do I do about it? In the situation, a neurodivergent person might share a memory of their best mess up. I would say, oh, you tripped on the beach in front of everyone. I remember my first week at CrossFit. I tripped over my own feet during line drills, and I was so embarrassed about it, I considered never going back. When I share these aspects of my emotional world, and we share these aspects of our emotional world, I'm bringing myself back into the memory. I'm including the emotions I felt when it happened. So not only am I demonstrating that I do understand with a concrete example, I'm bringing myself into that emotional state, even if it's painful for me to sit with your emotions with you rather than so hard. And we socialize differently. One of the hallmarks of neurodivergence is differences in socialization, particularly social communication. Sometimes we're viewed as lacking reciprocity because of the way we socialize. And one example I've used over my time as a neurodiversity communicator is like, a friend comes over for a visit and the friend sits down on the couch and says, oh, I haven't had a drink in a while. And neuromajority socialization would say that that's a social cue. One that I'm going to undoubtedly miss, at least in the moment, and say, oh, I just had one, and then I'm like a big asshole. I'm going to be seen as rude as best for not offering, or at worst, like I'm rubbing my social position in that person's face because I'm there in my space. But I likely read it as they were stating a fact about themselves, and I was returning that with a pertinent fact about myself until like, removed from the social situation. Like, oh, yeah, social cue. One of the most pertinent examples for this crowd is parallel play, probably because when I was in school on both sides of the desk, that is, as a teacher and a student, I'd see parallel play corrected, right? So like perhaps Duval is laying on his back and sitting in the wheel of a toy car close to his face. 32, that's still one of my favorite things to do. And he likes the wind it makes, and he likes watching the pattern of the tire tread change, like a kaleidoscope, and he finds the sounds it's making soothing, and his friend Jayla is sitting next to him on the carpet and reading the book, and the texture of the pages is soothing to her, even though she's read it a million times, and the teacher's like, you need to read a book that's at your level. And she likes the breeze and the smell that's carried on it when she turns the pages, and the creaking it makes when she holds it. And they're happy to be doing what they love with someone they love, and there's no pressure to be anything but what you are in that moment. And this sort of parallel play, in my opinion, is not just different than socializing, it's a love language. Just be with me as I am right now. Unfortunately, what I often see from educators, therapists, and parents trying to get us to socialize in normative ways, like neuronormative, I suppose would be the word. They'll likely tell Duval to ask Jayla questions about what she's reading, or have Duval place the car on the ground and roll it, which would interrupt the patterns and the learning and the processing that's being done, as well as taking away the pleasant influence of the carpet on his back and the comfort of being a friend with that pressure. The ways they're playing and connecting is seen as inappropriate play because it's different from neuromajority play. Oh no. What you don't see is that Jayla is so immersed in her book that the questions would interrupt her monotropic engagement and frustrate her, or that Duval's very tired from long class because of the motor skills differences that come along with neurodivergence. So if he's resting his body and if he's set up, he'd be too tired to connect or too focused on the sensations in his body. Often we naturally know what we need to further meaningful connection until we're told that it's wrong, bad, or weird, even if we're not told that directly. That's the message we get when we're put into social skills groups that take away our neurocultural play and replace it with assimilative foreign play. You do parallel play too when you're on the couch with your spouse or your partners and your spouse is watching TV and reading a newspaper and you're texting on your phone, or when you're on break at work and you're filling up your coffee from the pot and your colleague catches up on emails. You're engaged in parallel play. Just because it's not a source of connection for you doesn't mean it's not for us. In the same way that everyone has different love languages, and when you aren't loved in your own love language, it can be hard to recognize. So someone whose love language is words of affirmation may not see their partner whose love language is active service saying I love you when they change the light bulb or carry the groceries in. This extrapolates to neurodivergent connection. It's not just the way you want to connect, doesn't mean it's not a connection. None of these modalities of existence are less valid than the other. We're trained to see them as less valid because of the cognitive frameworks that we've been taught about neurodivergence. But appeal to normality is a logical fallacy. To tell someone that something is better because it's normal is to say nothing about whether it is good or right or preferable, only that it's common. And in that vein, autism and neurodivergence is common. 1 in 44 people is diagnosed autistic or neurodivergent, and that's more common than redheads. The number doesn't account for all of the adults who misdiagnosis because they didn't present in typical ways, stereotypical ways rather. Like you're not a young boy clapping your hands and talking about trains, you can't be autistic. Or all of the youth of color who didn't get diagnosed or got diagnosed with conduct disorders instead of autism because of the institutionalized racism of neuropsychiatry, the number of girls, women, and AFAB people who were undiagnosed due to differences in presentation and socialization and how we socialize girl children to be little people pleasers. So how many people need to be diagnosed neurodivergent until it's just another modality of being rather than a set of deficits that need to be corrected? I suppose now that we have an understanding of neurodivergence, why is it important for someone to know? Because this is something I see all the time. I could hear like labels are bad. That's what everybody says. Like, why do we even need labels? Like, for the same reason you call yourself Scottish or American or a man or a woman or non-binary, just to share history and cultures customs, and experiences and trauma. It's important for autistic and neurodivergent youth to understand that they have a unique and a rich history, a unique and important set of strengths and not just deficits, and that there's a rich community and culture and cognition and space for them, and there's people like them. Like, if autistics outline the developmental milestone criteria, neurotypicals would be the ones delayed and pathologized. And autistic youth deserve spaces that are made for them because we've lived our whole lives, especially if we've attended public schools where we are square pegs pounded into round holes. And the problem with that is not that the hammering is hard work, that you're destroying a perfectly good square peg that does fit somewhere. The reality is neurodivergent kids will know that they're different, and then their peers will too. Giving them accurate language to describe it helps them understand the differences and wield them masterfully. I have a couple of tutoring students who have an autism diagnosis, and one who doesn't know as them. And there's a number of reasons parents or teachers keep it from them, but it's usually I don't want them to have a label. But even without the diagnostic label, I have them in that the ones I have are misbehaved or slow or stupid or troublemaker or non-compliant. Like, is autistic or ADHD really so much worse than that? Let me give you an example of how understanding our neurology leads to self-advocacy and acceptance, because it does. I could say that I'm clumsy, which is negative leading and inaccurate, or I could say that dyspraxia is part of my autism. It means my spatial awareness is impacted, and look out when I trip over my own feet, because I'm going to. I'm not broken, I'm just different. Or I could say, like, I feel like a bad person because I never recognize people's faces, which is negative leading and also inaccurate. Or I could say that prosopagnosia or face blindness is a common part of the autistic experience. It means I can find strategies to recognize people like haircuts or tattoos with their voice and communicate that this is normal and doesn't mean I don't care. When I have this language, I can treat myself with grace. I can treat myself with respect, and that means I can ask the same of others. Another reason they don't want is they're learned to not use the diagnostic label as a crutch, but not getting accommodation leads to long-term burnout. Ask me how I know. We can push through the anxiety and distress and feelings of brokenness and feelings of being alone in a world not made for us and not having the words or language to describe our experiences, or we could just ask for extended test time, for example. Because our brains are processing more information and making more connections. And when we can articulate this, when we know why, we can not only treat ourselves with grace and respect, but ask the same from others. There's power and determination in knowing. And when students know how their brain works, they can advocate for themselves. And as an aside, because I can just feel all of the opposition to this, I want to mention that everyone self-advocates. I often see neurotypical parents and educators saying that non-speaking learners or learners with higher support needs can't self-advocate. I hear them using functioning labels like low functioning, but behavior is often communication, and advocacy is more than verbal speech. Crying in response to stressful stimuli is self-advocacy. Turning one's head away from food is self-advocacy. Meltdowns and tantrums are self-advocacy. Throwing blocks or eloping or refusing to go to school is self-advocacy, and all communication deserves to be listened to. And there are a slew of somewhat easy ways, as having been a public educator myself, that we can support neurodivergent youth in schools. Like respectful IEP goals. One of the things I do in my work is I help craft respectful neurodivergent affirming IEP goals. When I so often see goals being written through the lens of compliance and making things easier for the people around the student rather than making things easier for the student themselves. Like the goal I see most often in non-neuroaffirming IEP goals is like decreasing protesting with adult directions. And what I don't see is any insight into why the student is protesting adult directions. There's often so many decreased behavior goals, but so rarely are there strategies that include discussing the logic of the protest with the learners themselves and joint troubleshooting how to decrease these with the child. Often, again, IEP goals don't account for the neurobiological reality that is neurodivergence, particularly goals that are rooted in things like behaviorism, ABA, PBIS. Things like motor skills difficulties are viewed through the lens of non-compliance. So a goal like, X will follow staff directions within 15 seconds of them being given, which is an IEP goal from my IEP in middle school, Does not account for dyspraxia or apraxia that often comes along with specific neurodivergencies. Learner may literally not be able to move their body to follow directions without thinking about it. And our increase in gyra and sulci, which are percentages in our brains, means we often have slower processing speed. This is what I mean when I say that IEP goals ignore neurobiological reality. We're more than a collection of behaviors to be corrected. And also when we accommodate neurodivergent learners, everyone benefits. We as educators, parents, when we talk about our feelings, or use direct communication with clear expectations, everyone benefits. When we have sensory accommodations in our classroom, like bins, STEM toys, or options for movement breaks or seating that accommodates fidgeting, everyone benefits. For me personally, and many neurodivergent people, particularly those with attention differences, movement is key to learning. When my body's moving, my mind is still. I need to face around and to flap my hands and to curl my hair with my finger in front of my face to help me process what is being said. The trouble arises again when we cross neurocultures. A neurodivergent person who's listening super hard looks exactly like a neurotypical person who's not listening. And you laugh, but it's so true. And like, there's the option of in-class movements if you don't want your kids to leave the classroom, like when it comes to bubble schools or yoga balls, and option for seating or ability to move up the classroom. And like, the reality is, like, if you're not sure someone can move and listen at the same time, check, like, hey, I see you're spinning in circles. Can you tell me what we're doing next? But the biggest way to accommodate and honestly teach neurodivergent kids that their well-being is important to them is to believe when we advocate for ourselves. Like, I can't count the number of times I mustered up the courage to advocate myself, whether it was in a vocal way, like we need to take a walk, or, you know, eloping or shouting, or another non-social thing to go away, only to be shot down by the same people who told me it was okay. Like, I can't have a movement break because I just went to the bathroom, and then dude is not wanting, just wanting to get to class. So when in reality, Jimmy's picking his nose next to me, and the sound of pencils makes me want to jump out of my seat, and the lighting is flickering, and I know that I could squeeze out some productivity in the last 15 minutes of class if I could just flap my hands around, but I know that my teacher will tell me quiet body, and also, see what I mean? When we say something's bothering us, believe us. I may need the sensory bin more than you think that I do. That doesn't mean I don't need it. And when we're allowed to use our regulation strategies, we naturally learn more. We learn that we're safe to be ourselves, which leads to less anxiety, which, guess what, leads to a regulated nervous system, and I then need to use the sensory bin less. And also embracing the STEM, man. It's not impacting our learning, it's helping it. Neurotypical educators love to tell us the importance of body language until we do it autistically. And then they're like, quiet hands, and other forms of expression. It's autistic and neurodivergent body language. And to tell an autistic person or a neurodivergent person not to communicate autistically is to tell an autistic person not to communicate. Instead of telling us not to STEM, try asking us what it means. For example, I noticed you're flapping back to front instead of side to side, how you're feeling. Or I see you're pacing a bit faster than usual. Does it mean you're excited or angry? And accessibility needs are going to clash. Loud vocal stems in the classroom can be disruptive if 30 kids are up and moving, and that's chaotic for everyone, but don't get me started on why we shouldn't have 30 kids in a classroom in the first place. But it doesn't mean give up or take away the ability to get people's needs met, and then involve collaborating with your learners to figure out how to get sensory and accessibility needs met in creative ways that are respectful to students to meet your own sensory needs. Because teachers also have our own sensory and accessibility needs. And I mean, lastly, presumed competence. It's pretty well known and accepted idea that there are multiple intelligences. The hallmark of neurodivergence is spiky skill profiles. Struggling in one area doesn't mean you'll struggle in all areas, and excelling in one area doesn't mean that we'll excel across the board. And I can info dump for hours about linguistics, but if you ask me to do math, like, please, anything but. Additionally, in my work, I see non or minimally speaking autistic kids in particular, and all neurodivergence, but autistic in particular, presumed to be unable to communicate. Like, the false equivalency is often made, and I want to drive home this isn't always intentional, but it's frequently used as like a gotcha moment against autistic advocates. That as if we're leaving non-speakers or those with higher support needs out of the conversation. I was non-speaking until I was 12. I was deemed trainable but not educable because of this. And we need to understand that non-speaking and or higher support needs is not tantamount to non-thinking and non-communicating. When we look for and listen to the ways that we do communicate, worlds will open up to you, and more importantly to them. Always presume competence. And again, as an aside, Presuming competence does not mean that assuming every autistic person is a genius or comes with savant powers. It means operating under the assumption that we are, in fact, people with the ability to learn and communicate just like you. And as an ending thought, I want to mention that all autistic and neurodivergent people are valid, valuable, and necessary human beings worthy of dignity, respect, and autonomy. Nobody's leaving low-functioning autistics out of the conversation. When I say all autistic and neurodivergent people, I mean all. I was like your child. I didn't speak till I was 12. I was talked about, but not to. I was in ABA for over a decade. I went from having been deemed trainable but not educable and being called low functioning, having high functioning lobs as an insult against me now that I can articulate my inner experiences. People like to assume that I'm high functioning, based on a few minutes talking to me or my post on the internet or an hour of speaking engagement and decide that I'm not like their child, maybe so, and that I am a middle-aged human being. I don't think I'm like any child, autistic or not. But I was exactly like your child, and I still melt down, and I still lose my words. And my sensory sensitivities determine where I can go and with what support. Few people see the in-between. Disability is dynamic. And what we term functioning is often based, like Kylia said, on environment, stress, and external factors. I want autistic awareness, not just acceptance. I don't want awareness at all. I want acceptance. I want liberation. I want all neurodivergent people to be loved and cared for, even when they don't have savant syndrome or math powers, and even when all we can give to the world is our presence in it. Autistic people talking about our strength doesn't mean we don't have weaknesses. It means you see the strengths in your child and we want you to see them too. Thank you, I suppose. Go dump on lots.
So thank you both. You're amazing. So we have time for.
Nobody's surprised.
I don't need to be here at all. We have time for questions. So in the room, shout them out, and obviously if you're on Zoom, type in the chat, and we'll get to your questions.